Hi class, this is Dr. McGonigal and this is video 3 for chapter 7. We are continuing our conversation about strategies for administering selection methods and using data. And last time we talked about ensuring that predictors are legally defensible. In this video, we'll talk about strategies for administering predictors and using predictor data. So let's first talk about what predictors of job performance should be considered. Well, to determine this, we go back to job analysis. So you might remember job analysis from chapter 3. This involved analyzing the job to determine what are the KSAOs needed, so the knowledge, skills, abilities, and other characteristics that are needed and relevant to the job, and also what are the task statements, the tasks that are involved in the job. The predictors that we choose, the ways that we determine how we select people on the job, they should measure unique variance in job performance. In other words, they should overlap or predict job performance. But the predictors themselves, so if we're using multiple methods, for instance, if we're using structured interviews and we're also using personality tests, that we're not overlapping in terms of what we're trying to get at with both of our methods. So the predictors should be highly correlated with job performance, but not correlated with each other. And the graphic on slide 29 illustrates this point. So in this case, our job performance criterion is sales performance, so performance in a sales job. And we have 3 predictors that we're using. So the first is an integrity test. So if you remember from chapter 6, that is a test that is meant to determine whether an employee will perform counterproductive work behaviors. We also have a structured interview. So remember from chapter 6 that our interviews should have structure to them in order to be valid. So having the same questions across different interviewees, having the same amount of time that the interviewees are allowed to use, and having a panel of people who are judging. So our structured interview is the second predictor. And the third predictor could be an extroversion test. And you can see that each of these overlaps with job performance, and that's what we would hope. That's what this is designed to represent. However, you can also see on slide 29 that they're not overlapping with each other. So the integrity test is not the same as an extroversion test. It's not getting at the same thing. It's getting at something different. And what we're getting at in our structured interview is also getting at something different from our extroversion test. So on slide 30 is an illustration of what we don't want. So we don't want a situation where the predictor measures substantially overlap with one another. So if we have, for instance, 2 ways of testing extroversion, so if we're assessing extroversion using a personality test, for instance, and we have one type of interview that's meant to get at extroversion, then that's like getting at the same thing. So that's redundant and it's not really a good use of time and money. So you can see that if they overlap with each other too much, they're not as helpful. But we want them to overlap with the job performance criterion as much as we can. Okay, so now let's talk about a few practical considerations when we're administering selection tests. You might remember from chapter 6 that we talked about using multiple criteria on their own versus a composite criteria, so that's one consideration. Some other considerations that we need to talk about are cutoff scores. So cutoff scores are the scores that an applicant must receive in order to be considered for hiring. For example, if you had given an intelligence test and you wanted to use those scores to determine who gets hired, you might want to create a cutoff score for that. So if it's on a scale from 0 to 100, for instance, you might create your cutoff score at like 60% or 70% or 80%. Depending on what your levels of intelligence are that you think you need for the job and that are supported by the research. In terms of determining a cutoff score, there is no universal good cutoff score. It depends on the job and the organization, and again, it would be based specifically on the type of job that you're looking at. There are 3 guidelines that the textbook offers in terms of determining the cutoff score. One is that you want to begin with a job analysis, otherwise known as work analysis. Number 2 is you want to examine validity evidence. And number 3 is you want to set a cutoff score that's high enough to ensure that the minimum standards are met. Banding is another thing to talk about, and that is referring to treating ranges of scores as similar to one another. So the idea behind banding is like you would treat everyone who got a test score between 70 and 80% to be in the same band. So they would be considered similar to one another or on the same level. So the idea is that all selection procedures contain some error, some measurement error. So test scores that are not that far apart can be treated as equivalent because they're not necessarily meaningfully different. An example of banding is actually the grading system that we have for final grades at UNC Charlotte. So all scores that range from 90 to 100 are considered an A, right, for your final course grade. And anything that is from 80 to 89.9 would be considered a B. So regardless of the actual number that you got, an A is an A at the end of the semester. In terms of accuracy in our prediction, our selection decisions can be categorized into these 4 categories. So we have false negatives, false positives, true positives, and true negatives. And so false negatives are people who had failed the test, they did not meet the cutoff score, and were not hired, and they would have succeeded on the job. So in other words, they were incorrectly rejected from the job based on their test score, but they would have done well in it. False positives are people who passed the test and were hired, but were unsuccessful on the job. So in other words, they did well in the test and they were hired, and then they didn't do as well in the job. So they were incorrectly selected for the job. True positives are people who passed the test and were hired and were successful on the job. So in other words, these people were correctly selected for the job. And true negatives are people who failed the test, so they were not hired, and they would not have been successful on the job either, so they were correctly rejected for the job. The goal is to maximize true positives and true negatives. In other words, maximize the hits that we get and minimize the false positives and the false negatives. In other words, the misses. In other words, we don't want to fail to hire someone who would be successful on the job, because then we're missing out on their talents and some good job performance from them. We also don't want to hire someone who would be unsuccessful on the job. Let's take a look at the graph on slide 33. So you can see on this graph, on the x-axis, this represents test scores, and ranging from low on the left-hand side to higher as you go toward the right-hand side, and also scores on job performance. So you could imagine low scores being at the bottom and job performance going up as you go up toward the top. The dotted vertical line represents the passing or cutoff score for your predictor variable. So if this is our score on our intelligence test, just for example, we could say that this is a score of 50, and people who did not score 50 would not be given the job opportunity, and people who did score higher than 50 would be given the job opportunity. And then we have our cut score here for job performance. And above the line indicates good job performance, and below the line indicates poor job performance. So this red kind of oval in the middle here is another graphical representation of a correlation. So we could imagine that there are a bunch of dots within this oval, and each dot represents a person and their score that they attained on the test score and their job performance score. So for someone who is in the true negative category, down here on the bottom left, they scored low on the test, so they're in this lower range here on the left side for the test score, the x-axis. And they also were low on job performance. So they are in the lower side of the job performance, because remember we said that job performance increases the higher you go. So that's our true negatives. To the right of those are our false positives. So these are people who passed the test score, so they got above a 50 on that test score, but they also then performed poorly on the job, and we can tell that because they are low on this y-axis. So these are our false positives. If we move up from false positives to the upper right-hand quadrant, we see that someone in this quadrant had passed the test score, that passed the cutoff score. So again, they achieved higher than our score of 50. And in fact, they actually did perform well in the job, and we know that because they scored above our cutoff here for job performance. So these are true positives, people who we hired and they did well in the job. To the left of the true positives in the upper left-hand quadrant are our false negatives. And these people who are people who scored low on the test, so you can see that they are on the left-hand side of the cutoff in terms of their test scores, but they are in fact above the cutoff in terms of job performance. So hypothetically speaking, they were rejected from the job, but they would have performed well. So that is represented by anyone that would be in this area here for false negatives. What this slide 34 is illustrating is a test predictor that has very high validity. So if you remember back from our chapter 2, when we have a correlation that is very strong, that tends to be clustered around a line that, in this case, it's a positive relationship, so it goes from the lower left to the upper right. And you can see that for this particular test that has very high validity, if you look at the dots of the red, imagining that there are some dots in there, for the false negatives and the false positives, it's just a very small piece, right? So it's just like a tiny sliver of red here that is in each of those quadrants. And in fact, most of the scores fall into the true positives and the true negatives. So that is a graphical illustration of what happens when you have high validity. In other words, it's when you have validity that is very high, the number of misses gets very low, falls close to 0, and the number of hits gets to be very high. And we are likely to make optimal decisions regarding hiring in this case of high validity. On slide 35, we have a graphical representation of what happens when validity is very low. So when validity is very low, we don't have that line, that oval shape or that line that we saw in previous slides. Instead, we have a circular pattern of results in terms of people performing well or not so well in terms of the test score, and then performing well or not so well at work. And you can see here that if we imagine that this like oval is a pie, and we have different pieces of the pie here for each of our 4 quadrants, they are all about the same size. So if our test has very low validity, it's just as equal a likelihood of having a false negative or a false positive as it is as having a true positive or a true negative. In other words, when validity is very low, we are just as likely to make good decisions or get hits as we are to make bad decisions or get misses. And in fact, if the validity was low like this, there would be no advantage or no point in using that predictor for selection. Slide 36 illustrates what happens when you move the cut score. So if we, instead of having our test score cut off at 50, increased it to 70, and so you can see that the test score line moved over to the right, then what would happen to our true positives, our true negatives, our false positives, and our false negatives? Well, you can see here, based on the graph, that the number of false negatives goes up a lot. So these are people who would have done well on the job. You can see that their job performance is on the higher end of the y-axis, but they were not selected for the job. So in this case, we're missing out on people who would have done well in the job. You can also see that our true negatives have increased a lot. So these are people who failed the test, they didn't make the cutoff score that we gave, and they also would have performed poorly. You can see that our false positives would be very small in terms of the amount of false positives. So in other words, people who passed the test are likely to actually do well in the job, and we have a relatively larger section of true positives here. So in other words, almost all of the employees who pass the test would be successful on the job. Slide 37 shows what happens when you move the test score to the left. In other words, when you decrease the cut score or the passing score that is needed to pass the test, you can see what impact that has. So previously we said that our test score cutoff would be 50 and it was in the middle, and then we moved it up to 70 and we observed the effects on that. Now what happens if we move it to the left and we make it, say, 30? So more people are passing our cut score on our test. So again, our job performance is on the y-axis, and that ranges from low at the bottom to high at the top. And we can see that decreasing the passing score increases the false positives, but decreases the false negatives. In other words, we have this large section of people here who had passed the test, but they would not perform well in the job. Their job performance is below the cutoff. In this case, all applicants that might be successful on the job would be hired. You can see that the number of false negatives in the upper left-hand column, or quadrant, I should say, is very small. Okay, so now let's talk about utility. Utility of a selection method refers to its usefulness or monetary value of the selection procedure. So you can think of it as a cost-benefit ratio. And this is affected first by the cost of using a selection procedure. So how much money will it cost the organization to implement this? And we can think about the costs in a number of different ways. So it might be literally that the organization has to buy a test or a video interview method or some form of selection tool from a consulting firm or from another organization. So there's that cost to consider. There are also costs in terms of employee time to use and implement those selection methods. So cost has a number of different factors that are involved. Number two is the validity of the selection procedure. And what we mean by that is how strongly does the selection procedure actually predict employee job performance? Can it tell us who is going to perform well in the job? And we've seen throughout the demonstration of the accuracy and the errors in selection that having a high validity instrument is very important. And certainly the validity, the more validity you have in a selection procedure, the more utility it'll have, as long as you have like a relatively low selection ratio. So in other words, if your organization is hiring everyone who applies for the job, it doesn't matter how valid your tool is because that you're hiring everyone. You don't even really need to use a selection procedure. So assuming that you are trying to be selective and you have a relatively small selection ratio, validity will really make a big difference. For number three, remember the selection ratio is the number of applicants who are hired for the job. In other words, the number of vacancies, job vacancies relative to the number of job applicants. So just like I said, if an organization is going to hire almost everyone who applies, then there's really no benefit to introducing a selection procedure. The cost will not be worth it in that case. And number four is the potential cost of bad selection decision. So you might think of jobs for which it is really important to get good people in those roles, people who are going to perform well and not do counterproductive work behaviors. A few just off the top of my head include like airline pilot, train conductor, bus driver, anyone who's in charge or in a position where other people's lives are in their hands. Maybe a surgeon, for instance. These individuals because they have an influence on other people's lives, the cost of a bad selection decision, so hiring someone who is not qualified for the job or who will not perform well, is potentially very high. So organizations need to take that into consideration as well. Okay, so we are now on the last part of our conversation about strategies and strategic implementation of selection procedures, and that is considering how the applicants experience the hiring process. We refer to this as applicant reactions, and we need to consider what applicants perceive as fair and just during the selection process. We talked about this previously in terms of face validity, and that's certainly one piece of it. So face validity is referring to how much the selection procedure appears to be valid for the job that the person is applying for. Research shows that regardless of the country, applicants' perceptions of different selection procedures are very similar. Applicants respond more positively to work samples and interviews. So if you imagine, or if you remember work samples from Chapter 6, that is asking people to perform actual duties that would be required by the job. Also, interviews are seen as valid by applicants, and particularly structured interviews, as we know, are the type that we want to be using. On the other hand, applicants react more negatively to personality tests and integrity tests. So they may not see the direct connection between these and the job performance requirements, and so that is something that organizations need to consider. It is effective for employers to explain to applicants why they are using certain selection procedures. So if it's not obvious, then the employer should make it clear as to why this is important and why it's related to performance on the job. And applicants' perceptions about how fairly they are treated during the hiring process can affect whether they accept a position that they are offered. So if they feel that they are treated unfairly during the hiring process, maybe they just won't even accept that position, and that's a losing situation for the organization that's looking to hire them. So it's important to keep these things in mind.